If you are injured in a car wreck and want compensation, call this number. You may be entitled to some financial compensation. If you have taken this medicine or have been exposed to this chemical, you can call this number because you may be entitled to financial compensation. Or as J.G. Wentworth puts it, it's my money and I want it now. Isn't that the American philosophy? Isn't that the idea that you see so much in our culture, that it's all about me, me, me? What can I get out of things? What do I deserve? After all, this is America, right? And as Burger King says it, have it your way. I don't think that's what Jesus would say, though. The passage Andrew just read for us is in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, Jesus teaches through what we have come to call it as the Sermon on the Mount. And numerous times throughout this passage, we read the phrase, "You have heard it said, but I say." And this actually happens a couple of different times, and it's interesting. All of the "you have heards," he says, you've heard, do not murder someone, but I tell you, don't even be angry. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. I tell you, don't even lust. You've heard it said that if you divorce, you should give a certificate of divorce, but Jesus raises the bar on that as well. He says, you have heard it said that you should not swear. Jesus says, just let your yes be yes. Your word should be good enough. He says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, but I say, if you get slapped on the cheek, turn to your other also. And over and over, Jesus raises the bar here. The last one, he says, you've heard it said, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. If you will, turn with me to Matthew chapter 5, the passage that Andrew just read for us. It's interesting as we look throughout this passage that what Jesus is quoting from the Old Testament is commands in the nation of Israel, and they are commands speaking to the nation, not to the people of the nation, if you know what I mean. It's commands to the nation. This is how the nation should work. As if there were laws for the nation. In America, we have laws. This law, an eye for an eye, was a law for the nation, not for the individual. And I'll show you what I mean here. In Exodus chapter 21, 24, if you want to write these down, I don't have a PowerPoint tonight, but if you want to write these down and look at them later. In Exodus chapter 21, verse 24, Leviticus chapter 24, verse 20, and Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 21, it is very clear that the term that Jesus is quoting here, an eye for an eye, is a term that was used as part of a law in the Old Testament. One of the examples in Exodus is when if a woman is pregnant, is with child, and there are two men fighting, and they happen to run into this woman or hit this woman, when the child is then born, if there's anything wrong with that child, so the same thing should be done to the man that hit that woman. If a tooth is lost, then that man is going to lose a tooth. If an eye is lost, then that man is going to lose an eye. If the life is lost, then that person will lose his life. That's what it means there in Exodus chapter 24, an eye for an eye. So as you did, so it will be done to you. But it's very important that was not on an individual basis. That was not oh no, my child just lost his life because of something that happened. I am going to go take that life now. That's not the way it worked. It's a command for the nation. It's a law for the nation. The judges, the authorities are the ones who are to judge whether or not an eye should be taken for an eye. But you see that what happened is the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they took this law too far. Just like they did with so many other things, and it became quite literally an eye for an eye in all circumstances for the individual to take an eye for an eye. And Jesus says here, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye, but I'm telling you, speaking to the individual, not the nation, not the governing authorities. Jesus is not concerning those right now. Jesus is saying, speaking to the individual, if someone slaps you, turn the other cheek and let them slap that one also. If someone sues you for your tunic, or a better translation, your undergarment, give to them your outer garment as well. If someone forces you to go with them 1 mile, to carry their pack 1 mile, carry their luggage, whatever it may be, go with them 2 miles. And he does this with all of the other you have heards throughout the Sermon on the Mount here. You have heard that you shouldn't murder someone, but I say, don't even be angry. Don't even have anger. You have heard you should not commit adultery. I say you shouldn't even lust. Jesus is taking these commandments that were for the nation of Israel when the nation was founded and saying, I'm talking to the individual now. Because before, God's people were a nation, but now God's people are all over the world, in different nations, of different cultures, of different races. And so God's law, these things that Jesus is commanding here, are for the individual. Jesus is talking to the individual. If someone slaps you, don't go to the authorities. If someone sues you for your tunic, don't go to the authorities. Don't retaliate even. Turn to them your other cheek. If someone takes your clothes, give them more than they asked for. You see, all of these things that Jesus says, you have heard, but I say. He's speaking to the character of the individuals listening. The first part of that character I want to talk about tonight is pretty clear. It's the character of submissiveness or submission. Jesus is telling all of his hearers that they should have a character of submission. Each individual should. If you will, turn with me to Ephesians chapter 5. In Ephesians chapter 5, we see the first area that we should be in submission, and it's to one another. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21. Let's start before that. Verse 15, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 15. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of your time because the days are evil. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is, and do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, and submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. This is the first part of the character of submission. If people who follow Christ, Christians, are to have the character of Christ, they're to have the character of submission. And it starts with submitting to one another. Submitting to your brothers and sisters. You are not greater than any of your brothers and sisters. Instead, consider all of them as greater than yourself. Or as Paul puts it in Romans, outdo one another in showing honor. But I want to show you something really cool here in Ephesians 5 that sometimes goes under the radar. In verse 18, Paul writes, and do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but, so here, he's giving you an instead. Instead of getting drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, instead of getting your fill or getting that sense of euphoria from alcohol, he says, instead, be filled with the Spirit. Get your fill, get that sense of euphoria from the Spirit. You don't need alcohol to get that. Instead, you can get that from the Spirit. And he says, this is how you do that. Addressing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, worshiping together, singing together. That's one way. Giving thanks always for everything to God. Thanksgiving is coming up. We're going to have a great Thanksgiving service that Ted is putting the plans together for, and we're going to talk about things that we're thankful for. That's another way that you can be filled with the Spirit, get that sense of euphoria from the Spirit. And this last one is interesting to me. Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. can we really be filled with the Spirit through submitting to one another? Well, Paul says it right there. Paul says, be filled with the Spirit through your singing, through your thanksgiving, and through your submission. That's how you get that sense of euphoria. That's how you get that good feeling that in our physical flesh we crave so much all the time. And where we fall is when we look for that sense of euphoria, that good feeling from things of this world instead of things that are eternal, like the Spirit. But the character of submission starts with submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. That's the other important part, is I don't submit to you because of any other reason but reverence for Christ. You don't submit out of anything but reverence for Christ. But here's the thing, that reverence for Christ is the most important thing that we have in this life. That reverence for Christ is more important than anything else that we hold dear. And so therefore, because I love Christ, I love you. Because I honor Christ, I honor you. You see how that works? All the light comes from Christ. All the love comes from Christ. Everything good comes from God. If you will turn to Hebrews chapter 13. Hebrews chapter 13, this is the second thing, or second item in which we can look into our character of submission. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17. It reads, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls, as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you." Now, isn't that interesting? If we make our leaders groan and without joy, that's of no advantage to us. We're to submit to our leaders, or as they're also called, elders and deacons. We're to submit to them for they're keeping watch over our souls. They're in touch with us. They're keeping watch to make sure that no member of the flock goes astray. Therefore, we submit to them. And we're not just talking about a momentary submission when we feel like submitting. Because as we read back in Matthew chapter 5, this is a character. This is a part of the way you build your life. This character of submission. It's to one another. It's to our leaders. And one other, turn to James chapter 4. It's just a page over in mine. James chapter 4. Verse 7. "Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded." This is interesting. Because shouldn't our first reaction when we decide to be a Christian automatically be that we are submitting to God? You know, there's always unspoken rules and everything. And if you're a baseball fan, I'm going to be able to speak on your level here, because baseball has a lot of unspoken rules. It's quite interesting. If you watch baseball at all and the guy hits a home run and then flips his bat as he's walking to first, apparently it's an unspoken rule that you're not supposed to showboat on your way to first base. There are a lot of unspoken rules. When you have a big lead, you don't steal second base because you don't need the extra runs because you already have a huge lead. There are a lot of unspoken rules throughout the game of baseball that don't need to be spoken because it just is part of the game. It's part of respect for the game. There are a lot of Christians that think there are unspoken rules, but God goes ahead and says it anyways. You would think on the surface Submitting to God should be an unspoken rule. It should be something that everybody knows. It doesn't need to be written down. But this is how important it is that we should be centering our lives around God and running away from Satan. That God says, even though it would seem as though it's an unspoken rule, it's going to be spoken anyways. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. So as part of our character of submission, we're to submit to one another, we're to submit to our leaders, and we're to submit to God. The thing is, we see that example from Christ. It's not hard to pick up and put together an idea of how we should have this character of submission, how we should be submitting to one another, submitting to our leaders, submitting to God. It's not hard to wrap your mind around that when we see the example from Christ. Philippians chapter 2, if you will turn there with me. Philippians chapter 2 lays it all out for us about how Christ humbled himself, submitted himself. Verses 3 through 8, they say, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. Have this mind." We've talked about one mind all year long. This is how we have this one mind, because this is the mind of Christ. Verse 5, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." Jesus displayed this character of submission throughout his life. Jesus displayed submitting to people that wanted to slap him on the cheek. People that slapped him and spit at him and said, "Prophesy to us, who is slapping you?" But Jesus did exactly as he's telling people in Matthew chapter 5. If they slap you on the cheek, turn to them your other cheek also. He did just as he commanded his apostles when he said, "Love one another as I have loved you." In John chapter 13, right after he showed them how to love. Everything that Jesus commanded, he showed by example. Sometimes people get this obscure view of Jesus that he's just this guy that's giving out all of these commands. Jesus showed us how to do everything he is asking us to do. Whether it be in our love or in our submission. The thing, though, about this character of submission, when we read through Matthew 5, 38 through 41, and we read, "You don't get to take an eye for an eye. Instead, if you're slapped, you turn to them your other cheek. If you're sued for your clothes, you give them more than they asked for. If you're forced to carry a bag, you go further than you were asked to do." The false perception that is often seen in these passages is that Christians are to be these weak, passive individuals that you can take advantage of. You can go up to a Christian and get anything you want. You can go up to a Christian and they'll lay down because they're so weak. They're so passive. But I gotta tell y'all, submission does not equal weakness. Submission does not equal being passive. And I think that's what we see at the end of this passage in Matthew chapter 5. This is what we see here. This is why I believe Jesus included this last part of the commands of retaliation, as the heading says right here in Matthew 5. Because the last part is, if someone forces you to go with them 1 mile, then go 2 miles. Now, the context of this is quite interesting. When Israel the Jews were under Roman occupation. Roman soldiers could go up to any individual with their heavy bags. They're Roman soldiers, after all. They have all of this equipment. They could go up to any individual with all of their equipment, their heavy bags, whatever they're carrying along, their tent maybe, and force anyone to carry their bag 1 mile. And it's so interesting because you know that the Jews hated this. You know they didn't like being forced to do things that they didn't want to do. And even their idea of the Messiah was that the Messiah was going to come and free us from this Roman oppression. So when the Messiah comes and tells them, if you are forced to carry a bag 1 mile, go with them too. You know, the first thought was like, oh man, what do you mean? I don't want to have to do that. Idea of going above and beyond. It's not a weak or passive attitude at all that goes above and beyond, is it? We're to submit and yet go above and beyond in our submission. It's an interesting paradox that Christ has created here, but it's one that we're to follow with our character of submission and a character of strength. That's what it boils down to. Is that while we are submitting to one another, while we are submitting to our leaders, while we are submitting to God, while we're submitting to everybody in the world, just as Christ did when he was led to the cross, so too should we have a character of strength. Because as Paul wrote to Timothy in 2 Timothy, about this idea of submitting and yet doing so with strength. And I want to read his thoughts for you real quick. He says, such a response is literally invincible, to submit more than you are asked to submit. It entirely refuses to allow the evil person to control the situation. It shouts in clear terms that their abuse and insults cannot overcome the power and influence of Christ in our life. You see what's happening when someone slaps you? They expect you to fall down and cower. When someone sues you for your tunic, they expect you to turn away and cry in shame. When someone forces you to carry their luggage for 1 mile, they expect you to fall down tired and exhausted and weak. But when we do what Christ is telling us to do, to turn the other cheek, to give more than was asked, to go further than was forced, the power is completely taken away from evil. I want you to think about this in your lives now. Because it's not every day that you have someone come up and slap you on the cheek, or sue you for your tunic, or force you to carry their bag 1 mile. But it is every day that someone disrespects your Lord. It is every day that someone disrespects the creator of this universe. What Jesus has called us to do is to have a character of submission in any and every circumstance, and have a character of strength in any and every circumstance. The fact that the perception of submission is to be passive is incorrect. To have a character of strength is to have a character of submission. And to have a character of submission is to have a character of strength. We weren't called to be passive Christians. Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 through 41, it shows strength, it shows energy, it shows being active. And Romans 12:21, I think, summarizes our thoughts this evening perfectly. Romans chapter 12:21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. It's a simple message that everyone has heard before. It's a simple message to not be overcome by evil, but instead overcome that evil with good. And this is how we do that, through a character of submission as Christ submitted, but through a character of strength. And I'm repeating that numerous times so it soaks in, because we cannot afford to be one or the other. If we forget about submission and just worry about that character of strength, then we're nothing but a noisy gong and a loud clanging cymbals. And if we forget about the character of strength and just focus on this character of submission, then we are not speaking about Christ through our actions, through our lives, through our words, the way that he has commanded us to. They go hand in hand. We're called to be active in our faith and in our walk with Christ, not passive. But we can only show that if we get out of our bubbles, get out of the self-putting down, and realize that through Christ we have strength to be more submissive than you've ever seen before. I like the words of this commentator, that attitude takes all the power away from the evil one. That attitude is invincible. Throughout your week, you're going to encounter people who do not know Christ. You're going to encounter people who disrespect Christ, and you're going to encounter people who more or less verbally slap you. The question is, how are you going to respond? Is it going to be with a character of submission and a character of strength? Or is your first thought going to turn immediately to an eye for an eye and try to slap him back verbally? The choice is up to you. And tonight the invitation is more general. If you need the prayers of the saints, of your brothers and sisters, this is what we have the family of God for. I've spoken with our Wednesday night class the past couple of weeks about the importance of the family of God, the importance of having brothers and sisters here in this congregation to pray with one another, to lean on one another, to fellowship together. If you need to lean on the arms of your brothers and sisters tonight, there is not a better time. If you want to join this family and be part of the family of God through the waters of baptism, there is not a better time. Whatever your need may be, come forward as we stand and sing.